The train was not a part of this world. It was an iron beast of another time, another place, screaming its progress across a land that preferred silence. Its track was a raw, unhealed scar upon the earth, and the girl was the sacrifice tied to its altar. She wasn't kneeling, she was bound, her wrists and ankles lashed to the hot steel rails with crude hemp rope. Her faded calico dress was torn at the shoulder, and her sun-bleached hair stuck to a face streaked with sweat and tears. She twisted against the ropes, her futile struggles serving only to scrape her skin raw under the merciless glare of the sun. Caleb Thorne saw her from a distance, a shimmering distortion in the heat rising from the plains. His horse, a steady buckskin named Dust, plodded on, its pace unchanging. Caleb's first instinct, honed by years of solitude and survival, was to steer wide. But this was different. This wasn't a traveler in distress or a family with a broken wagon wheel. This was a deliberate, horrific act. This wasn't just trouble. It was an execution waiting to happen. To ride on would be to make himself an accomplice to murder. He had enough ghosts in his past. He didn't need to be haunted by one he had actively chosen to create. He thought of another face, another pair of eyes filled with a different kind of terror. A memory he rode hard every day to outrun. The similarities were a hook in his gut, pulling him forward against his will. With a low curse that was lost to the wind, Caleb nudged Dust into a canter, closing the distance quickly. He was breaking his own first rule: don't get involved. The West was littered with the bones of men who got involved. But the stark injustice of the scene, a lone figure bound and helpless against the indifferent cruelty of the landscape, was something his soul, scarred as it was, could not ignore. He reined Dust to a sharp halt a few yards away, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had even fully stopped. He drew the heavy bowie knife from the sheath on his belt, its blade glinting in the sun. The girl, Lydia Monroe, flinched at his sudden appearance, her eyes wide with a fresh wave of terror. "No, please," she begged, her voice thin and cracked. "Don't hurt me." "Saving your life, ma'am. Not taking it," Caleb said, his voice a low, rough growl. He knelt, pressing the sharp edge of his knife against the thick rope binding her wrists. The hemp was coarse and tight, biting deep into her flesh. "That train's due in less than an hour. It doesn't slow down for much." He sliced through the first rope, then the next, freeing her hands. She immediately began to work on the knots at her ankles, her fingers clumsy with fear and pain. "Who did this?" Caleb asked, his eyes scanning the empty horizon. He saw the tracks of a single wagon, leading away, heading east, the direction of civilization. My family," she choked out, the words a confession of unimaginable betrayal. "They left me. My father. He said the train would purify me. He said it was God's will." Her voice broke on a sob, a raw, ragged sound that spoke of a faith that had been twisted into a weapon against her. Caleb's jaw tightened until it ached. He'd seen all kinds of wickedness in his time, from the greed of outlaws to the desperation of starving men. But this was a special kind of evil, cloaked in righteousness. He cut the final rope at her ankles. The skin beneath was bloody and raw. He stood and offered her a hand. She stared at it for a long moment, then took it. Her grip was weak, trembling. He pulled her to her feet, and she swayed, nearly collapsing. He steadied her with a hand on her arm, his touch surprisingly gentle. She was light as a bird, and radiating a cold fear that had nothing to do with the day's heat. "Can you ride?" he asked. She could only nod, her gaze fixed on the endless silver lines stretching into the heat haze, the instruments of her intended death. Without another word, Caleb led her to his horse. He swung himself into the saddle, then reached down, his arm circling her waist. He pulled her up behind him, settling her on the horse's rump. She was stiff, her body a knot of pain and terror. "Hold on," he said, and it was an order, not a suggestion. She hesitated. Then her arms slowly wrapped around his waist, her fingers clutching the worn leather of his vest. He could feel her trembling against his back. He nudged Dust forward, turning the horse away from the tracks, away from the path of the iron beast, and pointed him west, back toward the place she came from, back toward the source of this monstrous act. He didn't know what they would find, but as they rode into the setting sun, leaving the lonely tracks behind them, Caleb Thorne knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just gotten involved. He had declared himself an enemy of a god he had no wish to meet. The journey to Redemption Gulch was a silent one, measured by the rhythmic plodding of Dust's hooves and the slow crawl of the sun across the sky. Lydia remained a tense presence behind Caleb, her grip on his vest unrelenting. He didn't press her for conversation. The trauma she'd endured was a raw wound, and the prairie was no place for careless words. Instead, he focused on the terrain, his eyes scanning the horizon, reading the subtle language of the land. He was a man more comfortable with the silence of the wilderness than the complexities of human emotion. And right now, that silence was a shared refuge. He could feel her exhaustion in the way her body swayed with the horse, in the slight tremor that still ran through her. He stopped once, by a small willow-choked creek, to water the horse and refill his canteen. He handed it to her without a word. She drank deeply, her eyes closed, the simple act of swallowing seeming to take all her concentration. She washed her face, the cool water tracing paths through the dust and tear tracks on her cheeks. When she handed the canteen back, their fingers brushed. It was a small but fleeting contact, but in the vast emptiness, it felt significant, a silent acknowledgement. I am here. You are here. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. The air grew thinner, cooler. Lydia stirred behind him, her posture straightening. "We're close," she said, her voice raspy, but clear. "It's just beyond that rise. In the hollow." There was a fragile hope in her tone that made Caleb's stomach tighten. He'd seen 100 boom towns and bus towns, places that sprang up on a whisper of gold and vanished on a puff of wind. He'd seen the dreams of men and women laid bare and baked to dust by the sun. He hoped, for her sake, that Redemption Gulch was different. They crested the final rise, and Caleb pulled Dust to a halt. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley as she'd said, was the town, or what was supposed to be the town. It was all there. A single street, flanked by a dozen or so buildings, a general store with a faded sign, a squat structure that might have been a blacksmith's shop, several small simple cabins, a meeting hall, larger than the rest, stood at the far end of the street. Smoke should have been rising from the chimneys. The sound of a hammer on an anvil, the murmur of voices, the laughter of a child, the small ordinary sounds of life should have drifted up to them on the evening air. But there was only silence, a profound, unnatural quiet that was deeper than the prairie's solitude. It was the silence of a held breath, the silence of abandonment. Lydia let out a small, confused sound. "What?" "Stay here," Caleb said, his voice low and hard. He swung down from the saddle, his hand instinctively going to the colt at his hip. He handed the reins to Lydia. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, or if you hear anything you don't like, you ride east. Don't stop." Her eyes were wide with a new kind of fear, not the despair of before, but a creeping dread. She nodded, her knuckles white as she gripped the leather reins. Caleb walks down the gentle slope and onto the main street of Redemption Gulch. Dust puffed up around his boots, settling in a fine layer on the porch of the general store. The door was slightly ajar, swinging with a faint, rhythmic creak in the breeze. He pushed it open. The interior was cast in long evening shadows. Everything was in its place. Bolts of fabric sat on shelves. Tins of beans and peaches were stacked neatly. Barrels of flour and sugar stood against the far wall. But a thick layer of dust, undisturbed, coated every surface on the counter. A ledger was open, a pen lying beside it, as if the keeper had just stepped away. Caleb ran a finger over the page. The dust was thick enough to leave a clean streak. No one had been here for days, maybe weeks. He moved methodically, from building to building. The story was the same everywhere. In the blacksmith's shop, a horseshoe lay on the anvil, half finished, the forge cold and gray with ash. In one of the cabins, the table was set for 3 people. The bread on the plates was hard as rock, a faint tracery of mold on its surface. A child's doll lay on the floor by a small cot, its painted eyes staring up at the ceiling. There were no signs of a struggle, no bodies, no blood, no ransacked rooms. It was worse than a massacre. It was a vanishing. It was as if every man, woman, and child in Redemption Gulch had simply stood up in the middle of their daily chores and walked away, leaving everything behind. He came back to find Lydia had not ridden away. She had led the horse down the slope and was standing at the edge of the street, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "All of them. Where did they go?" "I don't know," Caleb said, and the honesty of it was brutal. He gestured to the dusty, silent town. "But they've been gone for a while." She stumbled toward one of the nearest cabins, her home. The door hung open. She stopped at the threshold, her hand flying to her mouth. Caleb saw what she saw. It was the same as the others. A half-eaten meal on the table. A shawl draped over the back of a rocking chair. A life. Interrupted. She sank to her knees on the dusty porch, the fragile hope she'd carried on the ride now utterly shattered. This was a new, more terrifying abandonment. She had been left behind, not just by her family, but by her entire world. They hadn't just cast her out. They had ceased to exist. Caleb stood over her, a grim sentinel in the deepening twilight. The mystery of the girl on the tracks had just deepened into the enigma of the town that never was. They were alone, stranded in a place of ghosts, with the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The silence was no longer a refuge, it was a threat. And the question hanging in the air, more chilling than the coming night, was not just where the people had gone, but why. The first night in the silent town was a trial. Lydia refused to sleep inside her old home, the sight of its interrupted life too much to bear. She chose the porch, wrapping herself in Caleb's spare bedroll, her back pressed against the cabin's outer wall, as if seeking comfort from the very structure that now haunted her. Caleb took the first watch, settling on the steps of the general store across the street, his rifle resting across his knees. The moon rose, casting the empty street in a stark, silver light. Every creak of cooling wood, every whisper of wind through a broken window pane, sounded like a footstep. He watched Lydia. Even in sleep, she was not at peace. Her brow was furrowed, her hands clenched. He saw the strength he had suspected earlier, but it was the strength of a sapling in a gale, bending to the point of breaking. He found a small, carved bird in the dust near his boot, a child's forgotten toy. He picked it up, its smooth, simple lines a stark contrast to the rough texture of his own calloused hands. It was a tangible piece of the vanished life here, a small, solid piece of the mystery. When dawn broke, gray and cold, A decision had to be made. Redemption Gulch was a tomb, offering no answers and no sustenance. Their meager supplies wouldn't last. "The nearest town I know of is called Harmony," Caleb said, his voice flat as he kicked dirt over the embers of their small fire. "It's a good 3, maybe 4 days' ride southeast, through the canyons." Lydia looked up, her eyes dull with exhaustion. The canyons. The name itself was a threat, but staying here was not an option. "I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She held out a small, leather-bound book. It was her mother's journal. It was under a floorboard. "It's all I have left of them." She clutched it to her chest as if it were an anchor. It was her version of the carved bird he'd found. She nodded. "All right. The canyons." The journey was a descent into a different kind of wilderness. The rolling hills gave way to a vast, cracked landscape of rock and shadow. The world became vertical, a maze of towering red sandstone walls and deep, winding gorges. The sun was a merciless hammer in the sky during the day, and the nights were bitingly cold. Nature was no longer a vast, indifferent stage. It was an active antagonist. On the second day, their water ran low. The creek beds they crossed were bone dry. Caleb's face was a grim mask of concentration as he scanned the rock faces, his gaze searching for the dark green of ferns or moss, a sign of a hidden seep. Lydia, though physically drained, pushed on without complaint. She had a quiet endurance that surprised him. She learned to watch where she placed her feet, to conserve her energy, to read the subtle signs of the trail he followed. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the awkward silence of strangers, nor the tense silence of the ghost town. It became a shared, functional quiet, a language of gestures and single words. Water. Shelter. Wait. That evening, they found a shallow cave carved into a cliff face, just large enough to offer protection from the wind. Caleb managed to shoot a pair of rabbits, and the smell of roasting meat over a small, smokeless fire was the first real comfort they'd had in days. As they ate, the warmth of the fire seemed to thaw something in Lydia. "My father," she began, her voice soft. "He was the one who led everyone here. He said the world outside was corrupt, full of sin. He promised us a new Eden." She looked down at the journal in her lap. "My mother. She believed him. At first." Caleb listened, not interrupting. He cleaned his knife with a slow, deliberate motion, his attention focused, giving her the space to speak. "He could be very persuasive," she continued, picking her words carefully. "People followed him. They gave up everything. But it became stricter. The rules, the punishments. We weren't allowed to leave or to question." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "I wanted to leave. I told my mother. The next day, they held the lottery." "The lottery?" Caleb asked, his voice a low rumble. "Once a year, one person was chosen to be purified, to be sent out into the wilderness to be cleansed by hardship, so they could return worthy. They said it was an honor." Her voice was laced with a bitterness that was sharp as broken glass. "This year, they chose me. Only I don't think it was a lottery. I think my father chose me. As a punishment." The pieces clicked into place for Caleb. The single set of wagon tracks. The abandonment. It wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a sentence. He looked at the festering rope burn on her wrist, a detail he'd noticed before but hadn't commented on. It spoke of a struggle. She hadn't gone willingly. He put his knife away. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tin of salve. Without a word, he scooted closer and took her wrist gently. Her skin was raw and chapped. She flinched, but didn't pull away as he carefully applied the soothing ointment. His touch was surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were so scarred. "It will help," he said. It was the closest he could come to offering comfort. She watched his hands, then looked up at his face, illuminated by the flickering firelight. In the harsh lines of his features, she saw not just a hardened survivor, but a deep, abiding sorrow, a mirror of her own. "You've lost people too," she stated. It wasn't a question. Caleb's hand stilled for a second before he finished his work. He retreated back to his side of the fire, the invisible wall between them rebuilt. But a crack had formed in it. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, his gaze distant. "The past is a debt that never gets paid," he said, the words heavy with a history he wasn't ready to share. Lydia didn't press. She understood. They were two people, running from different pasts, who had found themselves on the same desolate road. Their shared hardship was forging a bond between them, a fragile trust born of necessity and a dawning, unspoken empathy. He took the first watch again. As Lydia slept, this time a little more soundly, Caleb stared out from the mouth of the cave into the immense, star-dusted darkness of the canyon. He thought he saw a flicker of light, far off, high on the opposite rim. It was there for a second, then gone. It could have been a trick of the eye, a reflection of a star, or it could have been the glint of a spyglass. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. They weren't just running from the wilderness, they were being hunted. The feeling of being watched clung to Caleb like a second skin for the next day's ride. He pushed them harder, his silence deeper, his eyes constantly scanning the canyon rims above them. Lydia sensed the change in him, a new tension that coiled in his shoulders. She didn't ask. She just matched his pace, her hand often resting on the precious journal tucked into her waistband. The attack came without warning. They were navigating a narrow stretch of the canyon, the walls so close they could almost touch them on either side, when a rifle shot cracked the silence. The bullet ricocheted off the rock face just inches from Caleb's head, sending stone fragments stinging through the air. "Get down!" Caleb roared, shoving Lydia off the horse and behind a cluster of boulders in one fluid, violent motion. Dust, the buckskin, screamed and reared as another shot kicked up dirt by its hooves. 3 men appeared on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the bright sky. They weren't ragged bandits. Their clothes were plain, dark, and practical. They moved with a purpose that was more terrifying than random greed. "The stray lamb must be returned to the flock," one of them shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. "The prophet commands it," Lydia gasped, pressing herself flat against the rock. "It's them," she breathed, her face pale with terror. "From Redemption Gulch. That's Brother Micah." Caleb didn't need any more explanation. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard on Dust's saddle, his movements economical and deadly. The man he had been for the last 10 years, the quiet drifter, the solitary rider, fell away, replaced by someone older, harder. A lifetime of instincts he had tried to bury surged to the surface. "Stay down and don't move," he ordered Lydia, his voice cold and flat. He fired, not at the men, but at the scree slope just below their perch. The bullet sent a shower of loose rock and gravel cascading down, forcing them to scramble for better footing. It was the opening he needed. He darted from their boulder to another, using the canyon's natural cover, each movement precise and calculated. Another shot from above chipped the rock near his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired. One of the figures on the ridge cried out and fell backward, disappearing from view. The shot was clean, efficient. It was the shot of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The remaining 2 men, enraged, began firing more recklessly. Bullets whined and spat around Caleb's position. He stayed low, reloading, his mind a cold, clear machine of angles and trajectories. This was a familiar, ugly dance. He hated it. He hated the man it made him. But right now, that man was the only thing keeping them alive. He spotted the second man moving to a flanking position. Caleb was faster. He burst from behind his cover, fired twice from the hip. The man staggered, clutching his chest, before tumbling down the steep incline. Now there was only one. Brother Micah, the leader. The shouting stopped. The silence that fell was more menacing than the gunfire. Caleb knew this part of the dance, too. The waiting. The test of nerves. He caught Lydia's eye. She was staring at him, her expression a mixture of terror and awe. She was seeing the man he had tried to hide, the violence he was capable of, the protector and the killer, one and the same. Suddenly, a wild cry erupted from above. Brother Micah, his face contorted with fanatic zeal, leapt from the ridge, a long knife clutched in his hand. It was a desperate, suicidal charge. Caleb stood his ground, raised his rifle not as a firearm, but as a club, and swung it with all his force. The heavy stock connected with Micah's shoulder with a sickening crunch. The man went down, in a heap, the knife skittering across the stony ground. Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly beginning to recede. He was alive. Lydia was alive. The canyon was quiet once more, save for the moans of the injured man. The immediate aftermath was thick with tension. Lydia slowly emerged from behind the rocks, her gaze fixed on Caleb. She looked at the bodies, then back at him. The awe was gone, replaced by a frightened confusion. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You moved like you've done this before." Caleb didn't answer. He walked over to the groaning man, Micah, and kicked the knife further away. He looked back at Lydia, his face a hard, unreadable mask. "Get some rope from my saddlebag." With Micah bound and their nerves raw, the truth finally came out. As Caleb tended to a shallow graze on his own arm, Lydia sat huddled, clutching her mother's journal. "You need to tell me everything," Caleb said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Who is this prophet?" Lydia took a shaky breath. "His name is Malachi Croft," she began, the name falling like a stone in the quiet canyon. "He found us all when we were lost. Farmers whose crops had failed, miners whose luck had run out, families who had lost everything. He gave us purpose. He gave us Redemption Gulch." She described Croft, charismatic, silver-tongued, with eyes that seemed to look right into your soul and see your deepest fears. He preached a gospel of separation, of purity, of absolute obedience. The town wasn't a town. It was his kingdom. The people weren't citizens. They were his flock. "He controlled everything," Lydia said, her voice growing stronger with anger. "What we ate, who we spoke to, who we could marry. He said the outside world was poison, and he was the only antidote. The vanishing of the town was no mystery to her. He's done it before. When he senses dissent, or feels the outside world is getting too close, he moves us. He finds a new valley, a new promised land, and we start over. He burns the old place to the ground so no one can follow. They didn't burn it this time," Caleb noted. "Because of me," she whispered. "I was the first to try and truly escape. He couldn't make an example of me if I was gone, so he left the town standing. A trap. He sent them back for me, to bring me back for a public judgment." Caleb finally understood the full, terrifying scope of the situation. This wasn't just a religious zealot. It was an organized, mobile, and utterly ruthless force, controlled by one man, and by saving Lydia. Caleb hadn't just gotten involved. He had declared war on a king. He looked at Lydia, really looked at her. He saw the terrified girl on the tracks, but he also saw the woman who had survived the canyons, who was now staring her past in the face. Her fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a core of hard-won resolve. "This Malachi Croft," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "He won't stop looking for you." "I know," she replied. "And now he'll be looking for you too." Her words hung in the air between them. The debt of his past felt heavier than ever, but now it was intertwined with a new one, a debt to her. He had saved her life, and in doing so, had irrevocably bound his fate to hers. 4 days later, a different kind of dust rose to meet them. It was the dust of civilization, kicked up by freight wagons, buggies, and 100 horses. They emerged from the canyons and saw the town of Harmony spread out in the valley below. It was everything Redemption Gulch was not: sprawling, noisy, chaotic, and alive. Smoke plumed from dozens of chimneys. The clang of a smithy's hammer was a steady heartbeat, and the distant sound of a saloon piano was a jaunty, profane hymn to commerce. For Lydia, it was overwhelming, a sensory assault after years of enforced quiet. For Caleb, it was a different kind of danger. They rode into town with their prisoner, Micah, slumped over his own horse, his hands tied. Caleb's entrance, a grim-faced stranger with a wounded captive, drew immediate attention. He headed straight for the sheriff's office, a small clapboard building with a tin star nailed to the door. Sheriff Miller was a pot-bellied man with tired, intelligent eyes. He listened to Caleb's clipped partial account that the man had ambushed them in the canyons, without interruption. He looked at Lydia, taking in her ragged state and the fear that still clung to her. He looked at Micah's fanatical, hate-filled glare. "I'll hold him," Miller said, locking Micah in one of the 2 cells. "But I'm going to have questions, for both of you." He glanced at Caleb's gun belt, the worn leather and the smooth, practiced way his hand rested near the butt of his Colt. "You look familiar. Have we met?" "I have that kind of face," Caleb said, his tone discouraging further inquiry. He wanted nothing more than to melt into the anonymity of the town. He took Lydia to the mercantile, buying her a new dress, sturdy boots, and food. The simple act of choosing a fabric, of holding a coin in her palm, was a foreign, liberating experience for her. But she saw the way people looked at them, the whispers behind cupped hands, the suspicious glances at Caleb, the pitying looks for her. They were outsiders, marked by the wilderness and the violence that had brought them here. They took a room at the boarding house, a clean, quiet place run by a stern but fair-minded widow, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Lydia slept in a real bed, but safety brought its own perils. The adrenaline of survival faded, leaving behind the raw ache of loss and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. The next day, as Caleb was leaving the stable, a voice cut through the noise of the street. "Caleb Thorne, I'll be damned!" Caleb froze. The voice was a key, unlocking a door to a part of his past he kept bolted shut. He turned slowly. Leaning against a post was a man with a scarred face and a gambler's smile. Elias Vance, a man he'd ridden with, long ago, when his gun was for hire and his soul was a cheaper commodity. "Vance," Caleb acknowledged, his voice tight. "Last I heard, you were a ghost," Vance said, pushing himself off the post. "They said you'd vanished after the Black Creek payroll job. Some said you were dead. Some said you'd found God." He chuckled. "Never figured you for the praying type." "I'm just passing through," Caleb said, trying to end the conversation. But Vance's eyes flickered past Caleb, toward the boarding house where he'd seen him go in with Lydia. "Passing through with company. It seems you've gotten soft, Thorne. Or maybe she's part of a new play. She's got nothing to do with you, or with who I was, Caleb said, a low warning in his voice. The encounter was poison. By that evening, the whispers in town had a name to go with Caleb's face: Caleb Thorne. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and excitement in the saloon. The man who rode with the infamous Dalton gang for a spell. The man they called the Lonesome Gun of Black Creek. Sheriff Miller's questions became sharper, more pointed. The fragile peace they had found was evaporating. That night, Lydia confronted him. "They're talking about you," she said, her voice quiet as she stood in the doorway of his room. "They say you're a killer. An outlaw." Caleb stood by the window, looking down at the street, his back to her. "Some of what they say is true," he admitted, the words costing him more than all the gold he'd ever stolen. It was a long time ago. A different life. He expected to see fear or condemnation in her eyes. Instead, when he finally turned to face her, he saw an unnerving clarity, a deep and steady compassion. She had been judged her whole life by a tyrannical father. She knew the brand of another's harsh verdict. "That man, the one they talk about," she said, taking a hesitant step into the room. "Is he the one who saved me in the canyon? Is he the one who doctored my wrist and made sure I ate before he did?" She walked over to him, stopping just before him. She reached up and gently touched the grim, tight line of his jaw. "Your past is a part of you, Caleb, just like Redemption Gulch is a part of me. We can't outrun it. But maybe—" her voice dropped to a near whisper. "We don't have to face it alone." In that moment, the last of his defenses crumbled. The crushing weight of his loneliness, the burden of a redemption he thought he could never earn, eased just a fraction. He looked down at her, at the incredible, resilient strength that radiated from her, and he saw not a liability or a complication, but a harbor, a reason. He slowly raised his hand, his scarred fingers covering hers on his cheek. The unspoken feelings that had grown between them in the dust and danger of the trail finally bloomed in the quiet of the small room. It wasn't a passionate declaration, but a silent, profound understanding. They were two broken halves of a whole they didn't know they were seeking, a shared past of pain, and now, perhaps, a shared future of healing. But as they stood there, finding a fragile peace in each other's presence, they were unaware that a new rider had arrived in town, a well-dressed, charismatic man who asked the stable boy where he might find a lost, troubled girl named Lydia Monroe. The devil arrived in a polished black buggy, not with horns and a pitchfork, but with a warm smile and a Bible in his hand. Malachi Croft stepped onto the main street of Harmony, looking every bit the concerned guardian. He was handsome, his hair silvered at the temples, his dark suit immaculate. He moved with an unshakable confidence, his eyes, the same eyes Lydia had described with such fear, sweeping over the town as if assessing a property he already owned. His first stop was the sheriff's office. He introduced himself as a humble servant of God and Lydia's spiritual father, his voice a rich, soothing baritone. He spoke of his profound worry for his dearest Lydia, a troubled, impressionable girl who had been led astray and kidnapped by a hardened criminal. He produced a worn, leather-bound Bible, and from it, a wanted poster, years old, but well-preserved. It offered $1,000 for the capture of Caleb Thorne, wanted for robbery and murder in the territory of Kansas. "The man you have in your town, Sheriff," Croft said, his face a mask of solemn concern, "is a wolf, and he has my lamb." Sheriff Miller, caught between the ravings of the prisoner in his cell and the plausible, well-spoken man before him, found his sympathies shifting. Croft's story, backed by the wanted poster, resonated with the rumors already swirling around Caleb. The poison spread quickly. Croft didn't need to shout. He spoke quietly to shopkeepers, to the blacksmith, to the women of the town quilting circle. He painted a heartbreaking picture of a devoted community praying for the safe return of one of its own. He was masterful, turning Lydia's escape into a kidnapping, Caleb's protection into predation. The townspeople, who had looked at Caleb with suspicion, now looked at him with open hostility. Caleb felt the change immediately. The storekeeper who had sold him supplies yesterday now refused his money. Men in the street angled their bodies to block his path. He was no longer just an outsider. He was a pariah. He found Lydia in her room at the boarding house, packing her small bag. Her face was ashen. "He's here," she said, the words catching in her throat. "I heard them talking on the street. Malachi is here." "I know," Caleb said grimly. "We need to leave. Now." "Where can we go? Caleb!" she cried, her composure finally breaking. "He will never stop. He'll hunt us to the ends of the earth. He'll use your past and my fear and twist everything until there's nowhere left to run." Caleb looked at her, at the sheer terror in her eyes, and he saw the abyss that had been his own life, always running, always looking over his shoulder, the next horizon, the next town, the next temporary escape, until it all caught up to him again. He could take her and run. They could disappear into the mountains, live like hunted animals, and maybe, for a time, be safe. But it wouldn't be a life. It would be an extension of the prison they were both already in. He walked over and placed his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "No," he said, his voice quiet but infused with a new, unshakable certainty. "The running stops here, in this town, today." This was it. The crossroads he'd been riding towards his entire life. The choice between the man he was and the man he wanted to be. For 10 years, he had run from the ghost of Caleb Thorne, the outlaw. But to protect Lydia, to truly free her, he had to stop running and finally face him. He had to stand his ground, not as the lonesome gun, but as the man who had doctored her wrist and listened to her story by a campfire. He had to stand as her protector. The confrontation happened in the center of town. Croft, flanked by Sheriff Miller and a growing crowd of curious and hostile townspeople, was standing on the steps of the hotel, delivering an impromptu sermon on the evils that lurk in the hearts of men. He was just about to call for a posse to rescue Lydia when Caleb walked out into the street to face him. A hush fell over the crowd. "Croft," Caleb's voice rang out, clear and steady. Malachi Croft's smile didn't falter. It widened. "Ah, Mr. Thorne, you've saved us the trouble of hunting you down. Release the girl. End this madness." "The only madness here is yours," Caleb said, his gaze unwavering. He ignored the hostile faces in the crowd, the sheriff's hand moving closer to his gun. His focus was entirely on Croft. "She's not your property. Her name is Lydia Monroe, and she is a free woman. A free woman to be preyed upon by a man with a price on his head," Croft retorted, his voice dripping with sanctimonious pity. He held up the wanted poster. "This is who presumes to be her savior. Good people. A thief. A killer." The crowd murmured, their anger turning on Caleb. "I've done things I'm not proud of," Caleb said, his voice carrying to every person in the street. He didn't deny it. He owned it. "I have a past, but my past is not a lie. Yours is." Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the door to the boarding house opened. Lydia stepped out onto the porch. She was no longer the trembling girl from the railroad tracks. Her shoulders were back, her chin was high, and in her hand, she clutched her mother's journal. She walked down the steps and stood beside Caleb. She faced not him, but the people of Harmony. "My name is Lydia Monroe," she said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. "And this man, Caleb Thorne, saved my life. The man who calls himself my father." She turned her fiery gaze on Croft. "Is a liar, a tyrant, and a thief of souls. He did not lose a lamb. He cast one out to die." She held up the journal. "My mother wrote down the truth. It's all in here. The punishments, the fear, the fortunes he stole from families who trusted him. He is the wolf, not Caleb." Malachi Croft's benevolent mask finally cracked. A flicker of cold, reptilian fury showed in his eyes. He had lost control of the narrative. He had lost control of Lydia. And in the Wild West, when words failed, there was only one language left. His hand moved subtly, a signal to two men who had been lingering at the edge of the crowd, men who looked suspiciously like the ones who had hunted them in the canyons. The final collection was about to be made, not with prayers, but with bullets. The signal was all it took. The two men at the edge of the crowd, Croft's hidden enforcers, drew their pistols. The townspeople screamed and scattered, a chaotic wave of bodies fleeing the inevitable violence. The street that had been a courtroom of public opinion instantly became a killing ground. But Caleb was ready. He had seen the men, noted their positions, understood Croft's final, desperate gambit before the man even made his move. The moment their hands went to their guns, Caleb was already in motion. He shoved Lydia behind him, toward the solid cover of a water trough, his own Colt seeming to leap into his hand. He fired once, a deafening crack that echoed between the buildings. One of Croft's men staggered back, his shot going wild into the sky before collapsing into the dust. Caleb didn't hesitate, pivoting toward the second gunman, but this one was smarter, already diving behind an overturned wagon. Sheriff Miller, his face pale with shock, finally realized he'd been played. He drew his own weapon, shouting, "Croft, you're under arrest." Malachi Croft simply laughed, a chilling, ugly sound. He pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from his coat pocket. "The only law here is the will of God," he snarled, his mask of civility completely gone, revealing the monster beneath. He leveled the tiny pistol not at Caleb, but at the sheriff. It was Lydia who saw it. While all eyes were on the gunman behind the wagon, she saw Croft's true target. "Sheriff, look out!" she screamed. Her warning gave Miller the split second he needed. He threw himself to the side as the derringer barked. The bullet tore through the fabric of his sleeve instead of his heart. The distraction was all Caleb needed. He fired twice into the wagon, the heavy slugs punching through the wood. A cry of pain answered him. The second gunman was out of the fight. Now it was just Croft. Caleb advanced on him, his Colt held steady, his face a mask of cold fury. He was no longer fighting as the hunted outlaw, the man running from a past. He was fighting as a protector, defending the small patch of ground where he'd chosen to make his stand, defending the woman who stood behind him. His movements were imbued with purpose, not just survival. "It's over, Malachi," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. Croft's eyes were wild with fanaticism and hatred. "It is never over. I am a vessel of the Lord. You cannot strike me down." He raised the derringer for another shot, but before he could fire, Lydia acted. She grabbed the heavy wooden bucket next to the trough and hurled it with all her might. It struck Croft's arm, sending the derringer flying. He roared in fury and lunged for it, but Lydia was there first. She scooped up a handful of thick mud and gravel from the street and flung it directly into his face. Blinded and sputtering, Croft stumbled back. It was the opening Caleb needed. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, but instead of firing the final fatal shot, he did something else. He slammed the barrel of his pistol against the side of Croft's head. The thud was sickeningly final. Malachi Croft crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence fell upon the street, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the distant, receding footsteps of the last townsfolk. The dust began to settle. Caleb stood over the fallen prophet, his chest heaving. He looked at his gun, then at Lydia. She was standing, trembling but resolute, mud on her hands and fire in her eyes. She hadn't cowered. She had fought. She had saved the sheriff. She had saved him. Sheriff Miller pushed himself up, clutching his arm. He looked at Croft's unconscious form, at the wounded men, at the wanted poster lying forgotten in the dust. Then he looked at Caleb. He saw not the killer on the poster, but the man who had stood his ground, who had disarmed an enemy rather than executing him. He saw the man Lydia had defended. "I reckon," the sheriff said slowly. "That poster might have gotten a few details wrong." He walked over and kicked the poster, covering it with dirt. "Seems to me like this town owes you a debt." Caleb holstered his pistol. The fight was over. The violence was done. He walked to Lydia, ignoring the sheriff, ignoring the bodies, ignoring everything but her. He reached out and gently wiped a smudge of mud from her cheek. His hand was steady. In her eyes, he didn't see fear of the man he was, but love for the man he had become. The past was not erased. Its scars remained on both of them, but it no longer had power over them. Here, in the dusty main street of a town called Harmony, surrounded by the wreckage of their old lives, they had found something new, not a promised land given by a false prophet, but a future they would build themselves, together. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden rays down the street, and for the first time, it felt like it was rising, just for them. The weeks that followed the showdown were quiet. Malachi Croft and his wounded men were shipped off to be tried by a federal judge. The tales from Lydia's mother's journal sealing their fate. The town of Harmony, shamed by its quick judgment and grateful for its salvation, offered Caleb and Lydia a tentative, respectful acceptance. They were no longer the outlaw and his victim, but the quiet man and the strong woman who had faced down a devil in their street. But they did not stay. The town held too many ghosts of that violent day. With the reward money for Croft's capture, which a sheepish Sheriff Miller insisted they take, they bought a small plot of land a dozen miles out, nestled in a valley with a creek that ran year-round. They bought a wagon, 2 sturdy mules, and supplies. They built a life the way they had built their trust, slowly, deliberately, and with their own 2 hands. Their home was a small, solid cabin, built from timber. Caleb felled himself. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the alpenglow paint the canyon walls. He would clean his tools, his scarred hands moving with a practiced care that was no longer about violence, but about building. She would read to him, sometimes from a book bought in town, but more often from her mother's journal. She wasn't reading the parts about fear and oppression anymore, but the early entries, the ones filled with hope, love, and descriptions of the wildflowers on the prairie. She was reclaiming her past, finding the beauty amidst the pain. There were no grand declarations, no passionate speeches. Their love existed in the quiet moments, in the way he'd bring her a wildflower he'd found by the creek, a silent echo of the forgotten toy bird in the dust of Redemption Gulch, in the way she would place a hand on his shoulder as he stared at the horizon, grounding him, reminding him he no longer had to ride towards it alone. The scars remained. The rope burn on her wrist had faded, but was still visible, and the haunted look in his eyes never fully vanished. But they were now just part of their story, not the whole of it. They had found their redemption not in a place, but in each other. They had learned that home wasn't a town you could build or abandon, but a sanctuary you carried within you, a safe harbor for another's weary soul. They had faced the worst of the West, its violence, its judgment, its unforgiving nature, and had forged something true and lasting in its heart.